Welcome to part 5 of Publication Ethics. This time we're going to talk about retracted literature. My name is Sharon Pierson. I'm the director, I'm on the faculty in the School of Nursing, the director of the Center for Aging, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Academy of Nurse Practitioners and of nurse, author, and editor. What we're going to talk about today in this last piece is the impact of scientific misconduct, including falsification, fabrication. We defined those terms in the overview, the first module that we presented here. Things that relate to manipulation of data or images. And then we want to talk about some resources for detecting image manipulation. It's becoming a bigger problem in journal editing now. And then we're going to talk about some corrections to published articles, and finally I'm going to end with developing your own process for finding retracted literature, because you're going to be responsible for finding that in any article that you submit. So I'm going to start with a couple of the big scandals. This is called the Medical Madoff, and it's a fascinating case. Again, a lot of this information comes from people that dig it up, like Retraction Watch. But Scott Rubin was an anesthesiologist, and he published in a 12-year period of time, he published 21 studies on post-op pain in orthopedic surgery that were quote-unquote pure fiction. The data were all fabricated. 10 of those studies were published in Anesthesia and Analgesia. And the editor of that was responsible for retracting those studies. And it took a very long time to investigate everything. Dr. Rubin was investigated by his facility, the Office of Research Integrity. He was sanctioned. He actually served jail time and was fined. But he had fabricated data that really changed the way pain management was handled in post-operative orthopedic surgery. And it was funded by a drug company. There was a competing interest that was really not disclosed, and it was just, it's just been one of the classic cases that we've been dealing with in the literature now for the past several years. Here's a second one that is very well known, Dr. Wakefield and the link between MMR and autism. There are many articles written about this also, but the thing that I thought was fascinating was this the time that it took to retract the articles, and the cost of the investigation was like £6 million before all of the allegations were uncovered and found to be true and the articles were retracted. So there is a big impact of scientific fraud on the medical literature, the scientific literature. And I created this graph out of from data that I found in an article in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and the citation is below here on the slide. But this basically talks about, you can see up here, if I can find the cursor here, right? Here is the primary study right here, and it enrolled 263 patients. And it was published in 2003. There were review articles, and the primary study was cited in 173 review articles. So these are articles that talk about, for example, reviewing the literature on a particular topic. And so the citations just keep growing and growing and growing in these review articles. Then, in addition to the review articles, down here in the lower right, I can't find my cursor again, there we go, there were secondary studies that were also generated as a result of the findings of this first primary study that enrolled an additional 35,929 patients. There were 58 secondary studies before the primary study was retracted. So this primary study had been cited a total of 581 times before it was retracted by the editors of Lancet, and it took 81 months to retract the study. So this study was out there. The study was retracted. The notice of retraction stated, the trial had not been approved by the ethics committee, the involvement of a statistician could not be verified, and the trial was not a double-blind study because Dr. Nakao knew the treatment allegation. One of these secondary studies was published 1 year after the retraction. So even after articles are retracted, they still have an influence on the scientific literature. And when there are big studies like this that are retracted, there is a huge ripple effect, as we noted in the first discussion that we had and the overview of this topic. So here's a case from COPE that talks about data fabrication. And basically the situation was that the reviewer didn't believe that the study could have possibly had suspicions, didn't believe that the study could have been conducted as it was written. He thought that the study itself design was flawed, but he really doubted that these particular researchers could have conducted this study in the amount of time that they said they did, because they had published 7 other studies that were very similar, that involved substituting one compound for another. And the reviewer wrote to the editor with a rejection saying, not only is the study flawed, but I don't think it was ever done, and here are the other 7 studies that I think are equally suspect that were published in 7 different journals. So the editor had contacted then the authors and said, this is what the reviewer said, and the authors never responded. So the editor of this, where this manuscript had been submitted, was left with the question of, well, so am I supposed to contact the other journal editors and say, this is what my reviewer said? And basically the decision by COPE was, no, the editor had done everything he could do, because to actually allege to other editors that that these publications were falsified could be construed as libelous if in fact the data were proven to be true. So it's a sticky situation that the editor is in. Remember, we only have jurisdiction over the articles in our own journal. We cannot we cannot do anything about articles that are published or out there in other journals. I'm going to switch topics here now and talk a little bit about image manipulation, which is becoming a really big issue. We've all taken vacations like this, where you stand in front of the Eiffel Tower and you look like you're towering over the Eiffel Tower or the pyramids or whatever. It's just a photographic trick, and that can happen with certain kinds of images. Some journals that publish, for example, gels or radiographs or other kinds of images that come from, that are generated by experiments, if the data are manipulated or the images manipulated, the intent is to give a false impression of the results of the study. There are some forensic tools, and this is fairly new at the ORI, Office of Research Integrity. Basically, we know that this is happening, and the tools, at least at first, were really not there. The forensic tools that are available basically are kind of add-ons, I think, to Adobe Photoshop, and you can basically drag and drop the image into this little program, and it will tell you whether there has been any kind of differential enhancement or anything that is altering the image as it's been submitted in the journal, to the journal. If you do make changes, for example, and this is not just for images, but if you make changes in your data, in your tables, you eliminate outliers. for example. That's a very common thing to do. It's acceptable to do, but you have to explain it. You have to say outliers were omitted. That clarifies things, and it provides the reader with the information that he or she needs to understand the results. So another thing that I see more frequently, I don't get images per se that would be subject to this kind of manipulation, but what happens sometimes is that tables do not get, if they're not set up appropriately in the original manuscript submission, they do not render properly when they are turned into the typeset program. So I see sometimes tables that create a false impression because the columns are misaligned. So you have the wrong data in the wrong columns. And it's very important when you prepare your manuscripts that you prepare them properly so that these things don't happen. And I still see, believe it or not, I still see people submitting Word documents using sort of like a typewriter feature where they're hitting enter after every line. Or they indent using the tab key to indent for tables. And when you when you convert a program with using those kinds of commands in the document, you get a scrambled mess. And I've even seen Greek words come up in documents where there were no Greek words in the original manuscript when it was submitted to the copy editing and the layout program. So be very careful when you prepare your manuscripts. I know you're anxious to get them out the door. You have a deadline. You want to get this published. You want to get that grant in. Take the time that it needs to make sure that your document is as perfect as it can be. So the last section that we're going to talk about here is how we correct the literature. When we find these problems, how do we make corrections? And what do the corrections look like, and what do they mean? So here are some definitions. You heard me talk about an erratum. It's just a correction of an error that's maybe not sufficient to cause change in interpretation of the work. I use that for a lot of times for spelling mistakes, especially with drug names. If you misspell a drug name, you can certainly cause a problem because the drug name could be another drug that would not be good, but it doesn't really change the interpretation of the work. It's just a spelling error. A corrigendum is a correction of errors of greater significance, and the significance might be enough to change your interpretation of the work. A statement of concern is a notice, and I've never really seen one until recently, and I'm going to show it to you because I thought it was kind of fascinating how it was done. But the publisher makes a notice saying that we have concerns about this manuscript. Something has come to our attention, and it's under investigation. But in order to alert you that there may be a problem here, we have published a statement of concern. And then a retraction. This is a statement by the publisher that quote-unquote removes the work from the scientific record. However, it's permanently linked to the original article, and the article is never really removed. The article is still supposed to remain there in the scientific literature with the permanent link to a retraction, and I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. All right, so this is an erratum that is, it's labeled erratum in PubMed, and the repository for all of these is the National Library of Medicine, which is accessed through Medline or PubMed. And this is and you can see right here, if I can find my cursor again, I don't know why it seems to disappear. Anyway. I just want you to see how difficult it is sometimes to, why is my cursor not coming here? There we go. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. It's very difficult to see sometimes that there is an erratum or a retraction, but this is the permanent record of the article, And maybe I'm just too impatient here. All right. Well, you can see this is from the journal that I edit. I happen to know that this erratum is a corrigendum because it does correct some statements that were made that were not, that really should not have been made in the article. But you see the original article, the title, the authors, and then underneath that you see erratum in. And you can see it was published in 2 months later after the original article was published. This one might be a little easier to see. This is the expression of concern that I mentioned earlier. This is a really interesting case that's being followed by Retraction Watch, actually. But you can see that it's the same series of authors, and that there are a number of the same series of authors involved in all of these articles here. But the expression of concern says this article corrects, and then the title of the article. And then it says that the following papers referenced in the above review have since been retracted by the respective journals. So this is correcting an article that had a significant number of references that had already been retracted. And so the editors are now saying, this is a cause for concern. We haven't fully investigated it yet, but we want to alert you to the fact that this article contains retracted references. So it's probably a first step to maybe a retraction, but who knows? You have to kind of follow it. And some of these cases go on for a long time. So where are all of these retracted articles? I think I already mentioned that they remain in the journals. For example, I retracted an article that had been published 10 years previously when it was found to be a duplicate publication. That journal is in print, it's out circulating, it's in libraries. I can't go around to libraries and remove all of the journals. I can't remove the article out of the journals. I can't call librarians and say, please remove the article from your journal. The article stays out there. And what happens is, in the Medline official record of the journal, there is permanently linked to it. So every time you pull that article up, you see, oh, there's the article, and it has been retracted. So this is a case of a retraction here that I did not too long ago. And it says the title of the article, there's my cursor, there's the title of the article, and when it first appeared is right up here in 2007, and then a retraction is linked to it in right here in this journal issue right there, and that is permanently linked to that in the Medline PubMed record database. There's another way to find retractions. This I did somewhere like the middle of the summer. It's now over 1,900 retracted articles. But if you go to PubMed, and you can see up here I'm in PubMed, and you go to, you just type in retracted publications, and you can, there's another place that you can scroll down to and link in to specific reports. And you can sort these retractions, but you can see it's a problem looking through 1,900 retracted articles to find one that's in your article. You cannot submit your article to Medline and say, hey, are any of these references retracted? You have to do the work yourself. And there's easier ways to do it. But for example, those articles that I talked about that were in anesthesia and analgesia, you could sort this by the journal title, and it would come up at the very beginning. Anesthesia and analgesia is probably within the first 3 or 4 pages of the retractions. So you could probably find all of those articles fairly easily by doing this. But if you're specifically looking for one article or one person, there's another way to do it. And you also cannot tell why it was retracted. You have to actually go to the retraction if you can access it. And sometimes retractions are behind a paywall. If you do not subscribe to the journal, you can't get the retraction, so you don't know why it was retracted. Here's another way of searching. If you're doing for example, your articles all relate to lipid metabolism, you can search under retracted publications and do a sub-search or an advanced search on lipid metabolism, and you'll find, I know for a fact that several articles have been retracted related to lipid metabolism, so I want to see if I could find all of them that way. And it's still very easy, I mean, it's still very difficult to find these articles in this way. You also run into the problem that if you're not using Medline, and there are other ways to search and other databases to search for these things, you're looking at a different format, and this may be a little hard to see. I've got a little arrow down here. Publication detail, the journal detail is at the bottom, and then publication detail is just above that. It says journal article retracted publication. So if you're using biomedsearch.com, which is something that a lot of people do use because it's got a fairly easy interface to use. But this is an article that's retracted from a nursing journal. Now, I didn't tell you how many articles are retracted from nursing journals, but I think I have a slide that shows you. It's very difficult to find them all, and it depends on how the journal itself is classified. If it's classified as a nursing journal, or if it's classified as another kind of journal. You may or may not find it if you search under nursing. But this is one that's retracted from a nursing journal. This one, I did do the search for retracted articles in PubMed and sub-sorted it on nursing journals, and I found 12 results. I've also done it and found 27 results. And it depends on whether you put retracted publications or retractions. It's inconsistent the way it comes up. So if you've only got nursing journals that you're citing, you're not going to be able to find them all just by sorting on nursing journals. Plus, you also should remember it takes 2 to 3 months sometimes for this link to be put into Medline. It doesn't happen instantly as soon as the article is published or the retraction is published. So there's still, a considerable amount of work to be done as far as being able to verify that your references are not retracted, that there is nothing wrong with your reference list, and that you can certify that you're not citing bad science. And why is this important? Well, the ICMJE guidelines again say that authors should attest when they submit their articles that they have not cited a retracted article except in the context of it being retracted. So in other words, you could say, if you're doing a review of the literature, you could say, this is how you did your search. These are the articles that you found. These are the articles that you included in your analysis, and you excluded this one in particular because it had been retracted. So that would be an appropriate citation of an article that's retracted in the literature. You're specifically excluding it in the context of a retraction. So this really adds one last step to your process when you are writing an article. You need to cut and paste each article title into PubMed or Medline or a database that accesses Medline. And when you do that, for example, I did that with this article I happen to know was retracted. So I cut and pasted the article in the search field there, Preoperative fasting for preventing perioperative complications in children. I just typed that in, so if that was one of my references, I would just cut and paste that into that search field, hit search, and I came up with 3 articles that were retracted. And partly the reason there are 3 of them is that it's from the Cochrane database. And you know that the Cochrane goes through and synthesizes literature from other published works. So the original published work was from that middle citation was in 2008, and that was published in a nursing journal. Then there was some sort of a systematic review that occurred in 2005, and then an update in 2009. So this is not my area of expertise. I don't know why these articles were retracted, but I did find that, and if you find instances like that as you are finishing up your article, preparing it for submission to the journal, be sure you do that one last step, because there may come a time when editors are going to ask you to sign a document saying, yeah, I've checked all my references, and I know that none of them are based on bad science. So publication misconduct and scientific misconduct are very serious issues. And this is kind of like the final warning or word on all of this. From people who, from someone like myself who has been an editor for many years, who's also been an academic. I have caught students cheating before we had, plagiarism detection. I've failed students in classes for cheating, for plagiarizing. And it is a very serious issue, and it's not worth the consequences to you as an individual. If you're caught, your reputation could be ruined. You could, if you're receiving federal money for a research grant, you could be investigated by the Office of Research Integrity. You could face jail time like Dr. Scott Rubin did. He was in jail for 6 months and he paid a hefty fine. You could lose your professional license to practice, and your degree could be revoked if you have cheated or plagiarized your thesis or your dissertation. We have now tools that can detect this very easily, and it's just not worth the risk. What you need to do, we've covered that in the previous modules here, as far as learning how to appropriately paraphrase and cite work, making sure that you are not plagiarizing anybody else's material, that the thoughts are your own, that their work is original, and that you have appropriately credited everybody who was involved in the research that you have done, whether it's as an author or a contributor. So this talk was meant to kind of summarize a lot of this material, and we broke it up into 5 modules. You can look at one or all of the modules, whatever you think is appropriate to your situation. But sort of the final cautions for whether you're faculty or student. If you are faculty, you should hold students accountable for their work. If you are working in research, you have to hold your colleagues accountable for work. I have had situations where there have been multiple authors, and one author has plagiarized and the other authors didn't know it, and the whole article was rejected. And they found out, the authors figured out who basically cut and pasted all the material, and they rewrote an article and submitted it, another article. But they found out the hard way that they could not trust their fellow student, that the student was not responsible did not act responsibly in completing her work. Make sure you follow the ethical guidelines for conduct of research. And then make sure that the images that you use or the tables that you use, they're not falsified, and that also they're appropriately credited for copyright. And don't base any of your conclusions, any of your studies, any of your reviews on retracted materials. Make sure you do that final step and submit the name or the titles of any articles that you've included in your manuscript into PubMed for a final check to make sure that it's not retracted. So thank you for viewing this material. I hope it helps you with your work, and this process was made possible by the University of Texas at El Paso and grant funding, and that is all appropriately cited at the beginning of along with these modules. And thank you very much.